Hey, welcome back, Casibang's crew. Today we are going to start talking about the brain. This is the brain part 1 video. You may want to just plan on watching this video twice because I am going to give you quite a lot of information in this video. It's a lot of information that you really do need to get written down and learn. So our objectives here: describe the nervous system and its subdivisions and functions in the brain, and then identify the contributions of key researchers to the study of the brain. So throughout this entire presentation, we're going to kind of compare the brain to a roadmap. And this is just a mnemonic device to kind of help you remember the different parts of the brain. So the first part that we're going to talk about is called the hindbrain, and this we are calling the hindbrain highway. So this is the part of your brain that is right in the back of your head, the part of your head that just kind of meets your neck, okay, so right back here. And we start with this part of the brain because this is the part that develops first. When we are just an embryo in mom's belly, this is the part of our brain that develops first. And think of it almost like a fist. Like this is our spinal cord, and this is our hindbrain. And then everything else develops around the hindbrain, okay? So this is, the hindbrain is the lower part of the brainstem, and it contains our cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, so our first sort of mnemonic device is the medulla. And these are like our state troopers that monitor the rules of the road, that monitor us on the road. The medulla is attached right to your spinal cord, so right here in the back. And this is where all of your unconscious functioning is happening. So your blood circulating, your heart beating, your lungs breathing, muscle maintenance. These are your life-giving functions, okay? Without your medulla, you are not alive, okay? So these are your life-giving functions. Very, very important part of the brain. And then we have the pons, and the pons is sitting right on top of that medulla. The pons is the bridge, right? The bridge that connects the brainstem with the cerebellum so that information can get passed between the brainstem and the cerebellum. The pons helps us with movement, breathing, sleep, and arousal. And then the next part is the cerebellum, and this is called the little brain because on its own, it kind of looks like a miniature little brain. It's a little bit folded and wrinkled like our brain looks like. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating fine muscle movement and for our balance. Okay, so the next section, so here is our hindbrain, and we're building this next layer right over the hindbrain, and it's called the midbrain. And this helps to integrate sensory processes and contains dopamine. Okay, dopamine, remember we learned about that in the neurotransmitter, dopamine releasing neurons. So here we have our reticular rest stop, or it's called the reticular formation. So these are fibers that carry stimulation related to our ability to sleep and arousal. So for example, if you're in a coma, if you're unable to be awoken, it could be that your reticular formation has been damaged. Okay, and then, we've have the hindbrain, we've done the midbrain, and now we're doing the very last layer that's called the forebrain. And this is the biggest part of the brain and contains the most complex parts of the brain. So the forebrain is our thalamus, our hypothalamus, our limbic system, and the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum is where our complex thought is happening, and our cerebral cortex, which is that the very outer layer of our brain, that wrinkly part of our brain that when we think of a brain we think of, that is the surface of the cerebrum, that outer layer of our brain. Okay, so the first part of your forebrain is the thalamus, and the thalamus is our sensory relay station. So if you've ever been like in a train station, okay, if you've ever been in a train station, think of a train station where you have all of these different train tracks heading off into different directions. Okay, that's kind of our thalamus. Our thalamus is the part of our brain, and you see it right here in the picture here, okay? It's the part of our brain where all of our sensory information goes. So it goes there first, and then the thalamus sends it out to the different parts of our brain that need that information. So for example, if we have information coming in from our sight, then that's going to get delivered to our occipital lobe that deals with sight. So it's the relay station. All of the information comes into there, and then it gets sent out to the different parts of the brain that deal with that particular type of sense. Every sense except for our sense of smell. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a second, okay? But every sense except for our sense of smell. The next one is the limbic system. And the limbic system contains 4 really important parts of our brain. Okay, so here we're going to call it limbic lane. Okay, so our limbic system has our hypothalamus, which regulates all of our biological needs, our hippocampus, which is memory, our amygdala, which is emotions, okay, mostly fear and anger, those really strong emotions that we fear. And then our olfactory bulb, which is our sense of smell, okay? And this is the reason that our smell does not go through our thalamus, okay? So here, if you look at this particular diagram, and don't worry, we will be diagramming brains in class for the next couple days. So here's our thalamus right here. Okay, our hypothalamus right underneath it, really teeny tiny. Our amygdala, again, really small. And then our hippocampus is this little green that goes all the way around, okay? That's our hippocampus. So our hypothalamus, first of all, hypothalamus does a lot of things for us, a lot of things for us. So a lot of our biological needs. It controls your autonomic nervous system. So remember, we talked about the nervous system. Autonomic nervous system deals with all of our organs and all of the things that we do without even really thinking. Our heart beating and our lungs and our blood flowing, those kind of things. It is the link between our brain and the endocrine system. So remember when we talked about the pituitary gland and we said it was the master gland. The pituitary gland sits right underneath the hypothalamus, and they work together. The hypothalamus controls our 4 F's, and this is something that I really want you to remember because this will help you. Okay, the 4 F's that we are talking about are food, fight, flight, and that other F word that you'll never hear me say that is talking about sexual motivation. Okay, so the 4 F's. So that is important for you to remember because if you will come across questions that will ask you a scenario and ask you what part of the brain is controlling that. So if you remember the 4 F's, food, fight, flight, sex, okay? So control sexual motivation, hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, okay? All right, your hippocampus. The way I always remember this is I always say, if you were to see a hippo on campus, you would never forget that. That would be such an amazing memory. So your hippocampus is all about your long-term memory. This is where all of your long-term memories are stored. All right, and then your amygdala, or Miss Amy GD. Okay, another way to try and help you, mnemonic device to help you remember it. Your amygdala is responsible for some of your emotions, mainly fear, anger, and aggression. Remember I said those really like high, hot emotions. Mnemonic device here, Amy is a shut-in. She's very fearful of what will happen outside. Okay, that might just help you to remember what the amygdala does for you. All right, and then the last thing is the olfactory bulb. Okay, the olfactory bulb is what helps us with our sense of smell. And the mnemonic device is thinking of an old smelly factory on Limbic Lane. Okay, your olfactory bulb is right here, right behind your nose. Okay, and it sits, here's your brain right here. So it kind of sits right up there next to your brain. So all of your sense of smell is processed into this olfactory bulb. It never goes to your thalamus like everything else. It gets processed right here. All right. The next part is your cerebrum. So this is responsible for all of your complex thought and where your cerebral cortex, that outer layer of your brain, is. So responsible for sensing, thinking, learning, emotion, consciousness, voluntary movement, lots of stuff going on in your cerebrum. This is also where we have our cerebral hemispheres. So we have a left and a right half of the brain, right? So if you've ever looked at a brain diagram, you notice that it looks like it's sort of split into two even sections. Those are our cerebral hemispheres. So again, going with our road map sort of analogy, we're splitting the neighborhood into two cul-de-sacs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what each hemisphere does. But there is what's called lateralization, which means one area, the left side of your brain, deals with specific tasks, while the right side might deal with different ones. The corpus callosum is the structure that's right down the middle of those two halves that hold those two halves together. Not only does it hold those two halves together, but it is a neural network. So all of those messages get delivered from the left half of our brain to the right half of our brain and vice versa, so that our brain works as one complete whole. And then the very last thing to know about the brain is that it is divided into 4 lobes, and we'll get to those in just one second. So as part of our cerebral cortex, there are 2 sections of our brain. So if you look at this particular brain right here, okay, this is our spinal cord, so this is the back of our head. So right here on the top, if you look at this kind of bluish purplish layer right there, it's just kind of like one line that goes all the way down. Okay, we're going to pull that little line out, and here's kind of what the cross section looks like. This is our motor cortex. So this is the area of our brain that is responsible for moving the various parts of our body. And this really super weird picture that you see right here, all of this very weird picture, is a map of our motor cortex. Through lots of study and experimentation, scientists and doctors have been able to map out this motor cortex and to find out that if you stimulate a particular part of the motor cortex, let's say I'm going to stimulate this part right here, this affects our arm movement. Okay, so if you were doing, a brain surgery and they stimulated or they gave you a little shock on this part of your motor cortex, it might cause you to raise your arm involuntarily. So what they've done is they've mapped this motor cortex, and they can tell what areas of the motor cortex are specifically associated with what parts of our body. And you notice that there are things that are much larger, like look how big this thumb is. That means that there's a larger area of the motor cortex that is devoted to our thumbs. Okay? Thumbs make us human, right? Being able to lift and move this opposable thumb. Okay, so it's not a big surprise that a larger part of our motor cortex is associated to that. Okay, again, our face. Okay, look at how big the lips are on this little image here. Okay, and that just means that there's a large portion of our motor cortex that it has to do with our lips. And our lips do a lot. They help us eat, they help us talk. Okay, so there's a large section of our brain that is associated with our lips. And similarly, okay, so again, we have that same image, but this time we're looking at this like gold section. So really similarly to the motor cortex, this part is our sensory cortex. So again, how we sense things. And again, the sensory cortex is mapped to specific parts of our body. And again, it looks like this map where you've got larger sections that are dealing with some of the parts of our body. So again, if we look at our lips here, okay, a pretty large section of our sensory cortex have to do with our lips. So that just means that there's lots of nerve endings. There's lots of sensations, sensitivity in our lips, because there's a larger portion of our brain that is keyed into that or geared into that. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I forgot to mention in the motor cortex, is both the motor and the sensory cortex. Look at this little note right here, okay? The left hemisphere section receives input from the body's right side. Okay, so this is the same in the motor cortex as it is in the sensory cortex. Okay, so we are receiving information from the opposite side. Okay, so that is important to know. Please make a note of that in your notes, because that is really important. All right, and then the very last thing that we're going to talk about are the 4 lobes of the brain. So the first lobe here, right in the back of our brain here, this is the occipital lobe. And this is our visual cortex. This is where all of our ability to see is happening. Up here on the top, okay, right on top of the occipital lobe is our parietal lobe. And this is where that somatosensory cortex is, okay? So where our body movement and senses. Over here on the side, this is our temporal lobe. Okay, the temporal lobe is mostly our auditory cortex, this is the area where we hear, which makes sense because it's right over here, right above where our ears are. So that makes complete sense that that's where our auditory cortex would be. And then the last lobe and the biggest lobe, okay, is your frontal lobe. Everything here in the front, okay, your frontal lobe. And it does a lot, okay? Muscle movement, thinking, problem solving, judgment, personality, okay? There's a lot that is happening in your frontal lobe here. Okay, so in the next couple days, we are going to diagram the brain. So we will again keep reviewing what each part of the brain does. And you'll have to know not only where they're located on the brain, in case there's a diagram that comes up on the exam, but you do have to know what they do for you. So we'll spend some time in class over the next couple of days kind of going over this. Remember, please, please, please bring questions into class, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.